Hello, everybody. We just finished talking about fire and whether or not it's a living thing. And we made this list of characteristics we would look for in a thing to determine if it's alive, and decided that since fire has 7 of these 8 characteristics, it's not a living thing because living things have to have all 8 of them. Fire is not made of cells. We can't take a sample of fire, a slice of it, put it on a slide, and put it under a microscope and find cells in there. So fire is disqualified as being a living thing. However, these characteristics we have listed are pretty basic. So we are going to condense them into 7 characteristics of life, and we're going to dive into them a little bit deeper and discuss the major concepts in biology that you're going to see using these 8 characteristics. And we're also going to talk about a couple of other basics in biology. So one of the main characteristics a living thing has to have is order. And we talked about cells. All living things are made of cells, and these cells have membranes, not just around the cell itself, but in a lot of cases inside of the cell as well. And those membranes are going to make little compartments in the cell that isolate chemical reactions so that they can happen at high speeds where life can be supported. So these compartments serve as places for chemicals to be sorted in a cell where they can be in the right situation to do these chemical reactions. So cells are the smallest unit of life, and there are 2 kinds: eukaryotes, which have nuclei and other membrane-bound organelles. So the nucleus holds the DNA for the cell, and all of these other membrane-bound organelles are compartments for these chemical reactions to take place. Prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus and other organelles. So they do not have these compartments inside to separate chemical reactions. Everything just kind of happens in one place. So they're a lot simpler, a lot less going on with prokaryotic cells. You are a eukaryote because your cells have a nucleus, okay? And we'll talk more about those as time goes on. Cells are the smallest unit of life, but they are made of smaller things, and they can come together to make larger things. So there is an organizational hierarchy to life, and you can see that listed here. You might need to look at your PowerPoint to have the whole thing. I leave out compounds. You won't see that on your EOC, but we can look at atoms as being the smallest unit of matter. Atoms building molecules, making organelles, and then we get to cells. So this is our first organizational level where we have life. These cells come together to make tissues, which come together to make organs and organ systems and organisms. And this is where we have an individual. These individuals can come together to make populations, which can be together to make communities, ecosystems, and then the biosphere, or all of the life on Earth. And this is what we study mostly with ecology, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. All life has to be able to process energy, and all of the chemical reactions that your body does is called metabolism. And you've probably heard of people having high metabolisms or low metabolisms. And so metabolism is how quickly your body burns energy or makes energy from the food that you consume. So there are things that go into your body, and we convert those things into energy, and what's left over comes out as waste. So we have 2 main processes that life forms are going to use to conserve or convert energy into usable forms, and then to use that energy later. And those are photosynthesis and respiration. You've probably heard of both of these. So photosynthesis, commonly done in plants. You have your reactants here on this side. So photosynthesis requires carbon dioxide and water. And here we have our products. So we have glucose, which is a sugar, and oxygen. Now notice with respiration, which is what we're doing, we are taking in this sugar when we eat food, chemical energy, and we burn that sugar in the presence of oxygen, okay? And that's going to give us this carbon dioxide and water, which comes out of animals in the form of urine. But what I want you to notice here is that the products of respiration are the reactants of photosynthesis, and the products of photosynthesis are the reactants for respiration. So we have a nice cycle here. We depend on one another. Respiration depends on photosynthesis and vice versa. And the whole goal here of photosynthesis is to store energy in these carbohydrates, and respiration is going to release that energy so that we can use it. And remember, plants also do respiration. They make this glucose for themselves. So this is how gas exchange is involved in energy processing along with consumption and excretion. Organisms all grow and develop. You did not start out the size you are today. That would have been hard on your mother. So growth occurs when a cell obtains materials from its environment and gets bigger in size. And cells can only get so big. At some point, it's going to be really inefficient for them to move materials around inside of that cell, and so they'll divide. Cells have to stay fairly small. On the other hand, growth occurs in multicellular organisms when we add cells to the body. As you grow from a baby to an adult, you increase the number of cells that your body has. So an adult has more cells than a baby. Development is a change in the function of an organism over time, or maybe even its physical characteristics. And you can see here the life cycle of a mosquito, from an egg to its larval stage to its pupa, and then as it emerges as an adult. So development is change over time. Growth is an increase in size or number of cells. Regulation is another characteristic of life, and to regulate, our bodies maintain what we call homeostasis. Homeo means same and stasis means state. So this literally means same state. You have an internal balance in the cell and in the body. So there's things that need to remain in homeostasis for us to be alive. One of those things is temperature. If you run a fever, you get really sick. Your body is out of balance. And we'll talk more about why fever is important a little bit later. pH, the acidity and alkalinity, how acidic or basic your body is, will determine how it's going to function. The salinity in your body, if you eat too much salt, you have high blood pressure, for example. So that's one way that your body can get out of homeostasis with salt. Water, very important. As far as regulation goes, you must stay properly hydrated, and we're going to look a lot at how water moves through the body a little bit later. So in order to maintain homeostasis, some organisms have to physically move themselves from one place to another. For example, a snake that's too cold is going to slither its way into the sunlight to warm up. That's a way of regulating its body temperature. Or maybe if it's too hot, it might dip its tail in the water so that it can cool off. But that's not the only way that organisms move. Cells have to be able to move materials around within the cell, and multicellular things need to be able to move materials through the body. So we have to transport materials, and you can do that passively, which does not require any energy. Materials just spread out. You've probably seen this if you've ever dropped food coloring in water. So here we have an example of this. You see all the little green circles here. There's a lot of those little green circles on this side. There's very few little green circles on this side. So we can see that they're flowing from a crowded condition to a less crowded condition. That's passive transport. We also see that with these little teal ovals. You see there's a lot of them on this side, very few of them over here. They're just going through a different kind of protein in this membrane. We'll discuss that more later. Active transport is the opposite. So we are using energy to push something against where it normally wants to go. You can see here we have very few of these little green blobs here. We have a lot of them over here, but we're moving them to more crowded conditions across this membrane. So this is the opposite of passive transport, and it does require energy in the form of what we call ATP to push things against where they normally want to go. All living things have to be able to reproduce. This is why we consider viruses to be non-living, because they're put together by cells. They're manufactured, much like a product is manufactured at a factory. So cells are putting together viruses. The virus is not reproducing itself. It's not making a copy of itself in any way. The cell's doing it for it. So virus is not alive. Living things, though, do need to be able to reproduce. You've heard of species. To define a species, there are many different ways to do this, but we're going to use this definition. A species is a group of similar organisms. They look alike, they act alike, and they're going to reproduce to have viable offspring. So that means their babies can have babies. This is why a horse and a donkey are not the same species. When a horse and a donkey mate, they make a mule. So they can reproduce together, but that mule is sterile and it's not going to be able to have babies. So the horse and the donkey are not the same species because their children are sterile. And that comes from a difference in chromosome number between these two different species. Even though they're similar, they're too different to be the same species. Sexual reproduction is going to require two parents. Your offspring are going to be genetically varied. Think about this. Humans reproduce sexually, and hardly any of us look alike. The only way you're going to look exactly like another person is if you have an identical twin, and even they have slight differences. So sexual reproduction produces offspring that are different from one another and their parents because they have DNA from both parents. They're a combination of the two parents. This is great for a changing environment because no two individuals are exactly alike. If that environment changes, it's probably not going to harm every single individual in that population. You see this with diseases like COVID. Humans are incredibly diverse, and this disease hits some people a lot harder than others because of this genetic variation. Asexual reproduction is the opposite. It's going to use one parent. And since you only have one parent donating DNA to the next generation, the offspring are genetically identical. They're going to have the exact same DNA as their parent and all the offspring that parent generates. So this is great for a stable environment that never changes because you have something that works. There's no reason to change it. However, if something happens in that environment and it does change to unfavorable conditions, if it kills one organism, it's probably going to kill them all because they are identical to each other. So you can see here some examples of sexual reproduction producing variation. All of these snails are the same species. This is the same shell in each column. It's just turned different ways. But you can see across each row, there's a lot of variation here within this species. This is an example of asexual reproduction in yeast. This is one yeast cell here, and then you can see all these tiny little buds coming off of it. And this is, it's basically cloning itself. So we call that budding, and we'll talk more about that later. All organisms respond to their environment. A stimulus is anything that causes a response. It is not the response itself. So detection of a chemical, I don't know about you, I smell bacon in the morning. I'm going to get up and I'm going to follow my nose to find that bacon. So that is a stimulus. It caused a reaction in me. Response to a sound. If somebody calls your name, waves you over, you're going to respond to that somehow, maybe in some way. So sound, light, vision, these are very, very common stimuli. They cause responses. For example, when you wake up in the morning, your eyes are probably going to look more like this. They're accustomed to being in the dark. But when that light comes on, your eyes are automatically going to go from being dilated to being more constricted. So this is a natural response. You don't have to think about this. It's just how your body reacts. So response can be voluntary. You can choose to do this response, or it can be involuntary, like the eyes that we see here, or vomiting, for example, when you have something not good going on in your stomach. Voluntary responses are when an organism would move, for example, toward a sound or maybe produce a sound itself. Our last characteristic of life is evolutionary adaptation. All populations change over time, and adaptation is anything that's going to allow an organism to survive and reproduce in its environment. That's a key phrase, survive and reproduce. Chances are if something survives longer, it's going to reproduce more and pass on this trait that allowed it to survive for so long. Remember, if DNA is copied, it can mutate or change, and we'll discuss how this DNA can become mutated. But in asexual organisms, this is the only way we're going to have adaptation occur. It's very slow. However, with sexually reproducing populations, you have changes that are being introduced in every generation, and those can be selected through natural selection. So can these mutations, but either way, natural selection occurs when these changes to DNA produce some sort of physical characteristic in an individual, and that physical characteristic either helps that organism survive better in the environment, or it hinders or harms that organism in the environment. So if the organism is harmed, chances are it's going to die and it's not going to reproduce and pass on that harmful trait. But if the organism is benefited by that change to its DNA, then it is going to survive longer and reproduce and pass that trait on. So that's natural selection in a nutshell. We can see that here. You've got variation in the population. There's more of them than can possibly survive. And there's something about this difference in this population that's going to be selected on by the environment. So for example, we have these birds here. These birds seem to prefer to eat these bugs they can see pretty easily, so the greens and the blues especially. But these more camouflage colors, the birds aren't seeing. And so this is going to help them survive longer, reproduce, and we see an increase in this trait in the next population. The blue and green are not completely gone. Some of those individuals did survive, but less of them survived to pass on that trait than the brown ones. So that's why we see this trait increase over time. And that's basically how evolution is going to occur. So in order to study organisms, scientists put them into groups. We like to sort things as humans and put them into groups. And that used to be based solely on physical characteristics. Well, these organisms can fly and these organisms can't. Or this group of organisms has fur and this group of organisms has scales. So that might be some old techniques used for taxonomy, but now we have these new types of technology that allow us to classify organisms based on their biochemical sequences, the chemicals, the molecules of life, okay? DNA, RNA, and amino acids, which make up proteins. We'll get to that next week. So this technology allowing us to sequence these things allows us to look at how these sequences have changed very slowly over time. The more of a sequence two organisms, two different species have in common, then the more closely related they are, because that DNA is what's being passed from parent to offspring, and those DNA changes are being passed from parent to offspring. So we have these levels of classification from domain all the way down to species. So this is your most inclusive level. The domain level has all of the organisms in the entire world sorted into 3 groups. So each group has a lot of organisms in it. They don't have a whole lot in common, but they do have some things. So these are your 3 domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Remember, eukaryotes all have a nucleus, so that ties these together. These are prokaryotic groups. They do not have a nucleus, but their cell walls are made of different materials, so they're a bit different from one another. The most exclusive group is the species level, which you might not be able to see, but it's on your PowerPoint. The species level only includes one type of organism. And remember, those are organisms that can reproduce together to make offspring that can also reproduce. So if you have a hard time remembering this, you can use the first letter of each word in a nice little mnemonic. Dumb, king, Philip, came, over, for, good, that's genus, and the S for species would be sushi or spaghetti or whatever else you like that starts with S. Okay, so you do have a way to remember this, and you'll probably hear me say that multiple times through the semester. Throughout this sorting, we end up classifying organisms. So organisms end up with a scientific name and a common name. Common names are what you call an organism as you see it: a gray squirrel or a gray wolf or a dog or a cat. Those are common names. Those change with language. For example, what we call a dog in English is not the same as dog in Spanish. That's perro, I think. So 2 different words. So common names change with language, but scientific names will not. These are usually going to be Latin. They're recognized worldwide by the biologists that would be studying them because these names do not change. They are always italicized, and they have 2 names. So you can see here we have 2 names. It's italics, it's in Latin. The first name is the genus, remember from our levels of classification we just saw. So this is the genus, and this is the species of this organism. So Canis is genus, lupus is species for the gray wolf. Notice that the genus is capitalized and the species is never capitalized. Now, when we classify organisms or we're determining these relationships, we are looking at their phylogeny or their evolutionary history. So we can put that on something called a phylogenetic tree. These are just tools to look at how organisms are related based on what we currently know. When you're looking at a tree, you have branches, which are the lines, and you have nodes, which are the intersections. So notice that between some of the nodes, you might have characteristics. This tells you this is where this characteristic originated, and every organism after that on the tree is going to have that characteristic. For example, all of these, from amphibians down to birds, have lungs and 4 limbs. Everything before this does not have lungs, like these fish have gills. Some of them might use a little diffusion even that are not on this tree. So these are characteristics that separate organisms out into groups. Now, when you see an intersection, this represents the last common ancestor between these two groups. It's something that is no longer alive, it's extinct now, but it had some characteristics between these two groups of organisms. So branches that stop before you reach the end of a tree, for example, if E ended right here, that would represent that it went extinct. It did not make it to present day. So present day is the end of the tree, and everything behind it is time that has gone by. Okay. So I think that pretty much covers everything for our biology basics. Just a couple of things to test your knowledge here. Which organism is most closely related to C, do you think? Hopefully you're looking at this tree and thinking D, because there are fewer intersections between C and D than any other species on this phylogenetic tree. The fewer intersections you have to pass between 2 letters or 2 species, the more closely related they are. So what organism would be most closely related to B? Hopefully you're thinking A. And if we come down to this tree, which organism is most closely related to a lizard? Hopefully you're thinking snake. Okay, so these trees can be turned in different ways, but they're always read the same. Now, the scientific method is a process that we're going to use a lot. This is just general thing you need to know, and you've probably used it a lot already. So first, we're going to make an observation. You would ask a question about that observation, develop some sort of hypothesis, a guess as to why you're witnessing this thing, this observation. Usually it's going to be written if then. For example, if a plant is grown in sunlight and another in dark, then the plant in light will grow taller than the plant in the dark. So if you do this, then this is what you expect to happen. That's how you write a hypothesis. You would then design and conduct an experiment, and you want to make sure that experiment has a lot of control. Most things are not going to change between your 2 treatments. So you're going to have one thing that is different between them that you're looking at. So we have our independent and dependent variables. The dependent variable depends on something else. This is what you are actually measuring. And the independent variable is what you're using to do this measurement. For example, a certain period of time, you are going to measure this plant's height. The dependent variable would be the plant's height. That's what you're measuring. The independent variable would be the time parameter that you set. During your experiment, you observe, you gather data, and then you would make some sort of conclusion and then communicate your results. In the scientific world, this is done through publications in scientific papers that are then tested by other people. Once you have all this done, you can ask another question, and the scientific method just kind of continues to go from there. So you're always growing the amount of information that you have. So I want you to practice being a scientist. I've given you a question on Canvas on your note guide to talk about here. So here you have flower colors, and we have different organisms, and you have the number of times one of these types of organisms was witnessed visiting a plant with this colored flower. So using just this information, I want you to try to either come up with the question or the hypothesis or the experiment that might have been used to get this data. So look at your note guide to determine what that question is. Okay. Hopefully it was a good little review of the basics for you. If you have any questions, hopefully you wrote those down, email me and I will answer those. Have a great day, guys. Bye-bye.